Welcome to This Medical Life podcast. These are the stories of medicine with Steve Davis and Dr. Travis Brown. This is the story of vitamin B12. Dr. Travis Brown, just to prove I'm not the doctor, you are. When I hear vitamin B12, I think, isn't that just vitamin B?
Well, it is a component of it, but remember we have B6, B, well, we've already spoken about, but 1, 2, 3, all these numbers that come in behind. And so when people say I'm taking vitamin B, the next part of the question is, well, which one, or is it all of them, or is it all packaged in that? And the amazing thing about vitamin B, and when you actually look at vitamins in themselves, this is something we've only really known about the last few hundred years. And diet is, we are far more aware of diet and how that affects our health and how that affects our well-being. But again, this is something that is recent. Now, vitamin B12 in itself, it plays an essential role in our health and in our body function. And so just generally, which we will get into this a little bit more with our guest coming up, but in just generally, vitamin B12 is important in creating and repairing DNA. It's important for red blood cell formation. It's also important in nerve function and cognitive function. And so this is a really important vitamin that we have.
It's the workhorse, by the way.
And it really is one of those ones that, even if we look back, 18th century is when we started to know about, scurvy. And this was, when you're looking at, vitamin C, this was the time that, it's only a few hundred years that was starting to be getting to known. And when we look, we actually have our first documented case of vitamin B12 deficiency. This was from Dr. James Scarth Combe in 1822. Now, he saw a 47-year-old corn merchant that had, quote, perfect health since childhood, and end quote, and he'd never been blooded, so clearly, never had the bloodletting, so his health had been fine. But he presented to Dr. Combe.
In the month of July 1821, that I was first consulted by Alexander Haynes, the subject of this case on the nature of his complaints. Even at that time, I was much struck by his peculiar appearance. He exactly resembled a person just recovering from an attack of syncope. His face, lips, and whole extent of the surface were a deadly pale colour. His motions and speech were languid. He complained much of weakness. His respiration, free when at rest, became hurried on the slightest exertion. Pulse, 80, and feeble. Tongue covered with a dry fur. The inner part of the lips and fauces were nearly as colourless as the surface. He says that his bowels are very irregular, generally lax, and his stools are very dark. Urine reported to be copious and pale. Appetite impaired. Of late, his stomach has rejected almost every sort of food, has constant thirst. He has no pain referable to any part, and examination could not detect any structural derangement of any organ.
Later on, the patient presented again. The patient's feet became edematous. He lost his appetite. His entire body eventually became edematous. Now, the treatments he received were pretty much throwing everything at him. So they tried giving iron, they tried giving sulfate and carbonate, they even tried mercury, they tried opium, dietary changes, but clearly not the right dietary changes. And the patient ended up dying, and Dr. James Combe did the autopsy.
I proceeded 36 hours after death to examine the body. Externally, it presented no peculiar appearance. The colour was nearly the same as during life. Not a drop of blood escaped on dividing the scalp. The liver was of its proper size and structure. There was no exudation of blood on cutting into its substance. The kidneys were nearly bloodless, pancreas of a pale reddish hue. The arteries were universally empty, and so were the jugular, humeral, and femoral veins.
that's why I love these old descriptions, is because they're just trying to piece together everything. They don't know what clue is important, and clearly this is just hypovolemia. This is a patient who is clearly anemic beyond, you're cutting skin and blood's not even coming out. And so the whole point behind this is that this patient, we now know, looking back, was severely vitamin B12 deficient. Their neurocognitive ability was impaired, their ability to produce red blood cells were impaired. And so it wasn't until Dr. Thomas Addison that we would make the clinico-pathological description. Now, the actual term pernicious anemia came from Michael Anton Böhmer, who was a German physician in 1871. And the reason he called it pernicious was because this was a harmful, often gradual type disease that was insidious and also untreatable.
Can I just say I love the word pernicious? I would hate to be diagnosed with anything called pernicious.
And this is the thing, the treatments they tried sunlight, they tried dietary changes, but again, not the right dietaries. They even tried something called Fowler's solution, which had arsenic within it. And so this is when we start to see the clues come, and the actual clue comes from Dr. George Whipple in the 1920s. Now, his question comes as a result from World War I. And the World War I question was, how do we get soldiers to have blood production? And the reason that they have blood production is because you got massive blood loss during World War I, but you didn't have adequate transfusion services. And so you sit there and go, how do we get soldiers to produce their own blood? And so they had, he with some other doctors, researchers, so it was Whipple, Hooper and Robscheit, they were actually experimenting on anemic animals to say, how do we get their blood production up? And so they fed them different foods and supplements, and then they would analyze their blood products or blood regeneration. And it was, they tried iron, they tried bread, they tried other foods, including cooked liver. Now, this is one of those weird times.
Oh, hang on, please don't make it cooked liver.
Well, this discovery may have been due to laziness.
Okay.
The lab tech didn't cook the liver and gave animals raw liver. And the raw liver gave huge blood production to these anemic animals. And so there was two physicians at the time from Boston who were actually found out. They were visiting George Whipple, and he gave them this little tidbit of information. And George Minnow and William Murphy sort of like, well, okay, if that has helped, will that help patients who have pernicious anemia? And so they got 45 patients who were diagnosed with pernicious anemia, and they gave them a daily diet. And so
of raw liver.
Now this was the list. So they had 120 to 240 grams of raw liver. They had 120 grams of meat. They had fruit and iron. That was a daily regime for these patients, 45 patients with pernicious anemia. And they had rapid improvement of their symptoms for 4 to 10 days. And so they looked at their reticulocytes, so that's the new red blood cells. They went from 1% to 8%. And they had reduced jaundice. They had increased hemoglobin and red blood cells. So they actually changed this. You're looking at me very weird.
Yeah, no, does pate count?
Well, I don't know. It depends what's in pate. So they mix. Does pate have a liver? Yes. Or does it have 120 to 240 grams of raw liver?
That's a lot. Not even Maggie Beer would eat that much.
And so they then took this previously fatal disease to now be treatable. And so they actually received the Nobel Prize in 1934, but they actually didn't know why it worked. And so it did work, but they didn't know why. And so eventually scientists found out that it was this extract from a liver that they were able to give then as an intramuscular injection that then worked. It would be in the a little bit later in the decades when vitamin B was actually isolated. Vitamin B12 was isolated, and they found out. But again, we know that this is an essential element. It's only obtainable through our diet, and it's only available through animal products. And so this is where we start to see strict vegans and vegetarians are at risk. And this is also, in the past, pernicious anemia would have been a dietary type thing. Well, now, because our diets are so good, it tends to be associated with our ability to absorb it. So this is why pernicious anemia is almost not dietary, but now an autoimmune condition where people have difficulty absorbing the actual B12. And so this is where we find ourselves. So we're looking at initial symptoms. We're looking at people who have maybe a bit of irritability, some cognitive decline, and a bit of mild anemia that can progress to what we say macrocytic anemia, so large red blood cells. And they can also get GI symptoms and neurological symptoms. And so this is where we find ourselves today. We often get questions because recently there's been some changes to the Medicare schedule as to when you can get what we call total B12 and active B12. And so we're just trying to clarify for doctors when to test, who's it's important to test, and what we can do with those results.
Professor Ken Sikaris is a chemical pathologist and Director of Chemical Pathology at Dorevitch Pathology. Professor Sikaris is a NATA-accredited laboratory assessor, founding fellow of the RCPA Faculty of Science, and a principal examiner in pathology informatics. He's a fellow of the Department of Pathology at the University of Melbourne. Ken is a regular guest on This Medical Life podcast, and we welcome him back. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Travis. Lovely to be back.
What's also lovely is the word that Travis has put in my first question for you. How common is pernicious anemia in the general community?
Yes, it's a very scary title, pernicious anemia, but it's not as it is pernicious because it's fairly rare. I mean, the true definition of pernicious anemia is a autoimmune condition leading to the inability to absorb B12. So there's antibodies against the cells in the stomach that produce an absorption protein, intrinsic factor. So that condition is like less than 1% of the population. I mean, in terms of autoimmune illnesses, it's not uncommon, but in terms of illness overall, and as a cause of low B12, it's a rare cause.
What does vitamin B12 or cobalamin actually do?
It's a very important cofactor, so it's required in enzyme reactions in the body, and virtually wherever there's an important methyl group transfer, so CH3, a methyl group transfer from one molecule to another, B12 assists it. So B12 is essential for all life, like bacteria, and I think there's only one or two plants that don't need it, but all animals and virtually all bacteria need B12 for this ability, for this enhanced ability to transfer methyl groups. Now that's a very where a methyl group's required. There are two particular places. So it's both in the mitochondria of the cell, the energy pack of the cell, and so there's an essential step there in the generation of succinyl-CoA from methylmalonic acid. So if you don't have enough B12, you can't make succinyl-CoA, which is an important energy mediator, and you'll accumulate the precursor, the MMA. So that's one of the tests of B12 deficiency. Another place that it's important is in folate is also involved in methyl transfers in the cytoplasm of the cell. And so B12 and folate play sort of a synergistic role in being able to transfer methyl groups. There's a particular amino acid that really relies on that methyl group transfer, and it's the formation of methionine from homocysteine. And so again, like MMA, if you don't have adequate levels of folate or adequate levels of B12, the homocysteine won't get converted easily to the important amino acid of methionine, and that'll lead to problems.
So we have lots of big names here. So cobalamin is vitamin B12. We have transcobalamin, and we have hollow transcobalamin. Can you make sense of this for us?
Yeah, look, the B12 vitamin it contains cobalt. It's a very precious thing, if it's required for all nature. So wherever it travels, it's chaperoned by a protein. Now we know. I'll go through this in terms of the importance of those chaperone proteins in health, and then you'll understand the factors. So cobalamin is the B12. When you eat food containing B12, your salivary glands will secrete a protein which will bind the free B12, just so you can start protecting it from the stomach acids and other things. So now, don't worry about the name, but that's called haptocorrin. That's the first place we see haptocorrin. So it can be produced by the salivary glands. Now, haptocorrin chaperones any free B12 down to the stomach. Now, the stomach produces acids and proteases to break down food further. And it also produces, as I mentioned before, the parietal cells produce intrinsic factor, which will immediately bind B12 and protect it. So that's the second binding protein, haptocorrin and intrinsic factor. And so then intrinsic factor will chaperone it down to the distal bowel, and there it can be absorbed by through its binding to intrinsic factor. And then once in the body, it's not let free either. It's sort of transported around the body. And so now the major transport protein is called transcobalamin, transport protein for cobalamin. And it really is the way that cells take up B12 through this transcobalamin B12 complex, or the whole complex, the hollow transcobalamin, B12 and transcobalamin. So, just to complete that story, so apo transcobalamin would not have any B12, but hollow transcobalamin has it. So anyway, I'm trying to clear out this nomenclature. Now the last thing is that we can store up to 2 years supply of B12 in the body, and we can't store it on the trucks, like the transcobalamin trucks. They're sort of limited. But there's that protein that the salivary glands can make, the haptocorrin. It's called haptocorrin because they sort of found it in the liver first. So haptocorrin acts like a binding protein for B12. Now we can see both the transport protein for B12, or transcobalamin, as well as the storage protein for B12 in the blood when we measure it. And so that's why when we're measuring B12, we talk about the total B12, which is a mixture of the transcobalamin and the haptocorrin storage. And that's where a lot of the confusion starts in testing, but you might have some other questions.
Well, that's the thing. So we often give a total B12, and then sometimes, which we'll get into a little bit later as to when we can, active B12. So why don't we just go straight to active B12, because that's clearly the physiological level.
Yeah, so the transported B12 is the one that's available for uptake by cells. So that's what we call the active B12, because the storage B12 can't be taken up by the cells. It's in storage. It relies on being transported to the truck to get to the cells. So active B12 is a measure of the functional availability of B12. To a degree, we don't care how much there is in storage. We only care how much is available to the cells at the time. And conversely, we don't particularly care about storage as long as there is some available to the cells at any time. So that's why the focus is that the hollow TC is the more useful test.
So when people ask for B12, why don't we just give them active B12?
The main reason is that the assay is more specialised, so it's more expensive. So in the laboratory, it costs maybe 3 times more to measure this specific transport protein for B12 when it has B12 on it, because that has to be whole transcobalamin, than to measure just all of the B12 in the blood. So it's more expensive. But it's a very good question, Travis. Really, that would be the logical thing to do clinically if finances didn't get in the way. And some hospitals have decided that's all they're going to do. Holo-TC, active B12, just that. You don't need anything else to determine the functional status of B12 in a patient, in most patients.
Then there does seem to be a little bit of disconnect, because I must admit there is quite a lot of B12 testing going on, but pernicious anemia is quite rare, almost. We're looking at 1%. So who then is actually at risk of the vitamin B12 deficiency?
So B12 is mainly in animal products, like plants don't store it, but like I said, people store it, and animals store it in all their tissues, particularly the liver is a good source of it, and so we get it from animal products, particularly meat and offal and so on. So the people that don't eat animal products, they're at the prime risk, vegetarians or vegans. Now, as I said before as well, you can have 2 years of store. So, if you just decided to go vegan, it might take you 2 or 3 years to become B12 deficient. And particularly, since you might still get some, other sources of B12, multivitamins, whatever. And the other dietary link is, with aging, because diets tend to be poorer in the elderly. And so there was a Blue Mountain study of elderly Australians, and they found that the prevalence of B12 deficiency in the elderly was 15%. Now, that sounds exaggerated, because we don't see the clinical consequences of B12 deficiency, like anemia as a clinical we don't see it in 15% of elderly patients. But there are early stages of B12 deficiency which are particularly worrying. So the major issues with B12 deficiency, the places where you see it hit home, are in the formation of red blood cells or anemia. And there we get this macrocytic anemia, which all doctors would know about. And then, but before that, this almost subclinical level of deficiency is a neurological thing. And so now maybe clear in a neuropathy, weakness and so on, but it's very vague when it becomes to cognitive defects. And so any elderly patient with sort of some cognitive problems, apparent dementia, the first thing you test is B12, because it might be the cause, and the prevalence of it being 15% in the elderly community. So that's why we're particularly worried about it in the elderly, because it may be contributing to cognitive decline way before the anemia presents.
Now, people are having supplementations because just why you said. Is there such a thing as vitamin B12 toxicity?
No, not that I know of. There used to be this, because it's, B12 and folate act together. Now, there used to be this problem if you had very low folate levels and then you gave B12, you might use up the remaining folate levels very quickly. That is not a problem in Australia, because we have mandatory fortification of flour. So whereas only 20 years ago, the prevalence of folate deficiency in Australia was around 7 to 8% of the population, now it's less than 0.5% of the population. Now, that wasn't done because of, B12 issues. That was done because folate deficiency has a particular impact on pregnant women and neural tube defects. And so the prevalence of neural tube defects has really decreased markedly because of the mandatory fortification. And the only patients that you'd be worried about who have folate deficiency are either people who don't have flour. Now, it's sort of like celiacs. So celiacs may not have flour. Or people that don't have flour, which is produced by, manufacturers. So like organic flour that's homemade and so on. So, but they're relatively rare. And those people tend to be looking after their health, and they get plenty of folate from foliage. That's what folate's from. So folate. The potential risk of just supplementing B12 and not folate really doesn't exist. So that's the only thing that I'd worry about. Yeah.
So when should GPs consider requesting vitamin B12?
Look, it's certainly in any. I actually did a study on this. I looked at which clinical notes on our request forms we received, Tavis, which clinical notes are more likely to have low B12 levels. Now, something that popped out immediately was vegans and vegetarian. They almost invariably have low total B12 levels and stores. So they're at like many-fold risk of B12 deficiency. So they should always have B12 measured. And the other thing they don't get, of course, is iron. So you should test. And often B12 deficiency in these populations goes hand in hand with iron, which is really important to realise, because sometimes you might think iron, you do the hematology, you look at there's anemia, it's macrocytic. Oh, snap, it's iron deficiency anemia. You didn't check the B12, which is also there at the same time. So really anybody who's iron deficient, or anybody who's vegan, should have both B12 and iron. So that's the first thing. But after that, the notes that came up were things like confusion, vagueness, query dementia. So those very subtle indicators, particularly in the elderly, neuropathies, not tiredness per se. Now, that's very important. So, lots of patients are tired and chronically tired. That's not the presentation. It's more of a neurological presentation of cognitive or neurological problems. So they're the important ones. Now, together with those vegans, that can't get any in their diet, there's also people who can't absorb the B12 from the diet. Now, there's a myriad of causes there. Now, it may be surgery. It may be diseases of the gut. It may be pernicious anemia, of course. There are drugs which inhibit B12 absorption. So all of the things that decrease acid production in the stomach can impact the absorption of B12. And that includes those PPRIs and the proton pump inhibitors, and the H2 antagonists. They all do that. And then there's the next class of drugs are things like anticonvulsants, and also metformin. That's a very common drug which impacts B12 absorption. So there are a lot of, almost iatrogenic type causes of B12 malabsorption, as well as, diseases. So vegans, any sort of gut problem that leads to malabsorption, including medication, and all those patients that present with neurological problems which are undefined and are likely to have poor diets. Yeah.
We often associate, and this is with the actual molecular pathway, homocysteine and methylmalonic acid. Now, this is now part of a reflex testing in Australia, which we'll get into a little bit. But how do these fit into low or high vitamin B12?
Particularly because total B12 was a mixture of the availability of B12 and the storage of B12, the total B12 is not a great indicator of functional availability. It's messed up by the storage part. And so originally, like over 20 years ago, people wanted proof that the low B12 was due to a functional deficiency of effectively hollow transcobalamin rather than a low storage. And so they'd look for the measures that the B12 is not working. And so the measures that the B12 is not available in the cytoplasm is a high level of homocysteine, because that was that reaction, homocysteine methionine, and the level and the test that homocysteine is not available in the mitochondria, B12 is not available in the mitochondria, is that MMA is not being converted to succinyl-CoA, so the MMA accumulates. So they're measures, they're functional measures. If those two things are elevated, one of the causes might be B12 deficiency. So it's seen as like a confirmatory test. But look, it's not black and white because, now homocysteine is a blood test and MMA tends to be a urine test. MMA is quite difficult to measure through chromatography and mass spectrometry. Homocysteines are relatively easy. You can use immunoassay to measure. But even though homocysteine is so much easier to measure, to be honest, it's almost diabolical in its complexity. So from the point of collection, homocysteine is amino acid. There's tons of it in the cells. If you don't separate the cells from the serum, the cells will gradually release their homocysteine and make the blood homocysteine look higher than it is. So it is important, regardless whether it's plasma or serum, that if you want to get a proper homocysteine, to separate it quickly. And then even then, with time, there's homocysteine loosely bound to the proteins in the serum or plasma, which will gradually increase the homocysteine. Then if that's not bad enough, men have higher homocysteine than women, and it's lower in pregnancy, and it increases with age, and it varies with diet. And so let's say it's not a gold standard test. But because B12 is so important, now this is probably the crux of it, Travis, is that people are so worried about those neurological consequences, which may be irreversible, that we'll use every tool in the armamentarium to prove to ourselves that the patient doesn't have B12 deficiency. So if a patient's got a clearly low B12, that's the end of the story, should treat. But if the B12 is in a borderline level, well, how can we be sure? Okay, we'll throw in, any test that we can find, like homocysteine. So it's a question, and we'll come to that with, the testing protocols, but it's just a question of clinical confidence.
Can you have a normal vitamin B12 and an elevated homocysteine? I think you've answered this, though.
Yeah. So you certainly can, particularly through bad sampling. Labs are pretty good at collecting samples, but not all of our samples are collected by our staff. And so, people may not, other doctors and nurses and other staff may not realise how important the sample handling is for homocysteine. And so we sort of lose control of that. Yes, ideally it should be fasting. A protein meal can increase homocysteine, but we don't insist on that. So, but I think the question here is, Travis, is that what's the harm in getting an aberrantly high homocysteine? The harm is that the doctor's going to give you B12. Well, we just said it's not toxic. So, in a way, and I really think this is my take-home message, is that if in doubt, just give B12. Like, the worst case scenario with a lowish B12 is that you've got low stores. You may have adequate amounts for the tissues, but you've got low stores. Well, give B12 and the stores will improve. It's no great harm. So I think that it is a valid thing to say that, if you're in doubt about B12 because it's borderline levels, a therapeutic trial of B12 may be all that's required. But if you really want proof that the B12 is required, you can go down that little bit of a messy pathway of those confirmatory tests.
Let's hold that thought, pause for a moment, and we'll resume and continue the conversation. We continue our discussion now with Professor Ken Sikaris. Can you tell us about the recent rule changes to requesting vitamin B12 for doctors?
I have to admit that I've got a bit of a role in the recent rule changes and the whole issue of holo TC. So when I was working at Melbourne Pathology, back in 2007, we were measuring holotranscobalamin as the improved test for almost 7 years before it appeared in the Medicare schedule. And we advised that, it was a better test. So patients with an equivocal B12, that borderline B12, they should have a holo-TC to work out with a better test, which was being done. And we forecast that about 30% of total B12s would need a holo-TC to refine that interpretation. And on that basis, our recommendations, I remember arguing to the government how important it was to have holo-TC. On the basis of that recommendation, it was introduced as a reflex test. So clinicians around Australia were sort of world leaders in having access to this holo-TC test or active B12 test routinely. It was so successful that, rather than costing the government a forecast $20 or $30 million a year, total B12 was about $50 million a year and still is about $50 million a year for Australia, their Medicare outlays. But when it started, holo-TC was $30 million a year, which is what was forecast. But it became so popular, labs started providing it for wider and wider ranges of total B12 because it gave you more confidence. They didn't want 95% confidence anymore. They wanted 99% confidence or 99.9% confidence. And so they reflexed at higher levels. And so the rebate for holo-TC blew out from $30 million to almost $200 million a year. And the government found that that was disproportionate in terms of what they expected and what was necessary. So what they did in the schedule was they said, we'll change the items in the schedule so labs can provide total B12 or holo-TC. And so now holo-TC, as I said, is a 3 times more expensive test. So labs have some labs have said, well, we'll swallow the cost and we'll do holo-TC on everyone because that's the better test. And a lot of teaching hospitals around Australia have made that the policy. Forget about total, we're just doing holo-TC. But in labs which are, sorry to get political here, but, the private industry, particularly in chemistry and in microbiology and genetics and so on, they haven't had a pay rise for over 20 years. And so, all the costs of reagents and staffing and extra regulations and so on meant that a lot of the companies are really struggling, and so they had to take virtually a pay cut of $200 million a year, and they said we can't afford that, so we're going to offer total B12 testing. So nowadays, if you ask for total B12, now depending on which lab you go to, it depends on how squeezed they are and what they're planning to do. But the total B12, if you ask for total B12, usually in private labs, you'll get the total B12. And if you ask for holo-TC, it may vary from lab to lab whether they can afford to do it anymore. And they may. Some have been thinking of charging the patient for the holo-TC. Others have said, we'll do the holo-TC as long as it's a group of patients who really, really benefit from the holo-TC. Now, that's an important issue that I need to stop here with, because there is one particular group of patients who really benefit from the active B12. So in pregnancy, the mother's chewing through her total B12 stores, the haptocorrin-bound B12 stores, because she's growing a baby, she's expanding her red cell mass, she's growing uterus, whatever. So she's chewing through those stores. So we know that during pregnancy, a huge proportion of pregnant women have low total B12s. And it's scary as hell for them to get a report that says low total B12, what's happening to my baby's brain development, all of that. And so, but if you measure the holo-TC, the active B12 there, it's preserved. Mothers don't use up all of their stores, to their own detriment, if you like. So, so in pregnancy, I think it's really important, if you don't want a whole lot of worried pregnant women, to have the holo TC. And some labs, well, particularly if the doctor tells us the woman's pregnant, we've got an opportunity of doing the test that's appropriate to them. Now, the other situation is in children, because children are sort of always skirting on the, as they grow, they chew up their stores as they go. So others have said that children are also a category that would benefit from not looking at the total B12, which we're worrying, looking at the holo TC, which is better. So they're the situations where labs might rebate or do for nothing the holo TC in preference to that. And even I would say the most responsible labs, if the doctor orders total B12 and said their patient's pregnant, they should do the holo TC if they can afford it and informed of it and all of those things. So I don't know.
Oh, no, it's a complicated. Yeah.
There's a few questions that have come up there. Look, there's one other situations where, and it's the reverse of that. So sometimes you can measure the total B12 and it's really high, like hundreds, like well away from the equivocal zone. And if you had have measured the holo TC, it would have been low. And that's really worrying. Now, there are some hematological conditions, tumours, lymphomas and so on, that can produce haptocorrin. They just produce haptocorrin without need. And so it looks like you've got lots of B12 stores, but it's just a tumour product. And in reality, the B12 levels might be quite low. And so hematologists know that if a patient's got one of these conditions, it's really important to get the holo TC, because otherwise the total B12 as a tumour product doesn't really give you the right story. But, GP shouldn't worry too much about that. It's really sort of, neoplastic grade conditions or dysplasias that cause that problem.
You've mentioned the grey zone a few times as to sort of equivocal. Is that the lower end of the reference range, or is that below the reference range?
Let's clear this up. So it's with very minor differences, the reference interval for B12, or the decision limits actually, is less than 150 is deficient. No. Now, some labs might say 135 or 100, it's around 150 is deficient. Above 700, you rarely get to unless you're on supplementation. So we'll say 150 to 700 is what we expect in healthy people. Now, the grey zone is at the lower level, 150 to 250. That's where we started when there was a 30% reflex, 150 to 250. And that gave you 95% confidence that the patient, if they were outside the 150 to 250 range, you were 95% confident that the patient didn't have B12 deficiency as measured by MMA or holo TC, whatever you like. So, and that was where, the schedule came in. We were expecting 150 to 250 to be the grey zone. But then it sort of snuck up. People say, well, I don't want 95% confident. I want 99% confident. And suddenly the 250 became 300 or 350. And then, and others said, we want 99.9% confidence. And it got up to 400. So that's about the highest reflex point in any laboratory in Australia. And so now to be honest, I think it's really awkward to be chasing 100% confidence in clinical medicine. Can we afford to be chasing 100% confidence in clinical medicine, particularly when with B12, you would have 100% confidence if you just give them B12.
Problem solved.
That's right. So when GPs ring me, and they've been ringing pretty commonly in the last month or so, about what they should be doing and everything, and say, well, if it's equivocal, don't worry about the testing. Just give B12. Now, for the 1% of people that have pernicious anemia, that's a little bit of a risk because that's why it's called a therapeutic trial of B12, because if you give the B12 and the B12 doesn't improve, well, maybe they've got a problem in absorption, like pernicious anemia.
Ken, do you have any final thoughts or advice for doctors? Or more sweeping conclusions that will solve the whole problem for the world as you've just shared?
Not really, other than B12 is, very easy to access and treat. And so, the heat should be taken out of the argument by saying that, if in doubt, treat the patient. This issue of, storage of B12, that's why heptacorin's there, so you can store some. So, why not keep people at optimal B12 levels by promoting the availability, particularly in elderly patients, promoting. If I can just raise one rare issue, which is where total B12, it may cause some confusion. So let's say you've got a patient who's got a total B12 of 200, and you give them supplements, and it's 200. You measure the holo TC and it's okay, but you just can't get the total B12 above 200. There are patients, and it's thought to be 1 or 2% of the population, who have heptacorin deficiency. They can't make the storage protein. So in those patients, they can't get that 1 or 2 years store. They've only ever got 2 or 3 months store. And so, I used to be quite critical of patients getting B12 injections, monthly B12 injections in elderly patients and so on. But in elderly patients that have a poor diet and may have this heptacorin condition because their B12 never comes up, it may be appropriate just to make ultra sure that they've got B12 levels that are okay, when they run into a period of illness where the nutrition's even poorer. So I do. But that's an illustration of, if in doubt, just, you can't get the B12 stores up orally, well, just give them injection, do whatever you can to keep the B12 high, because I do think it's really a treatable factor in cognitive decline, and cognitive decline is, one of our major risks in elderly Australians, which I think I'm now technically an elderly Australian.
Well, it's also a very popular vitamin out there in the community. I'm about to go on a big trek through the outback with a whole heap of people raising funds, and apparently I'm told they do a little bit of drinking at night, and the advice is take a Panadol and a vitamin B tablet before you go to bed.
Yeah, I mean, the vitamins are also to do with lifestyle. So, and it is true that if you have lots of carbohydrates in your diet or lots of alcohol in your diet, you do have a higher need for B group vitamins. So
there you go.
So plenty of excuses for you there, Steve.
But we have a 2-year store as well. Professor Ken Sikaris, thank you once again for being part of This Medical Life.
Pleasure.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts on social media. Dr. Travis Brown can be found on X. His username is @Dr. Travis Brown. That's Dr. Travis Brown. And Steve Davis can be found on LinkedIn. Go to linkedin.com/in/TheRealSteveDavis. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.